The rain fell in thick sheets, drumming against the empty streets of the city. Ethan's shoes were soaked through, his coat heavy with water as he wandered aimlessly, hands buried deep in his pockets. The cold bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, adrift in the hollow silence that had become his existence. Once, his life had been filled with music. He had played to packed concert halls, his fingers gliding effortlessly across the piano keys, weaving melodies that moved audiences to tears. But now, the music had abandoned him. Or perhaps he had abandoned it. He could no longer tell the difference. His feet carried him through darkened alleys, past flickering streetlights and shuttered storefronts, until he found himself standing before an old warehouse. The structure loomed against the night, its corrugated metal siding rusted and peeling. A faded sign hung crookedly above the entrance, its letters barely legible. He wasn't sure what drew him inside, perhaps the promise of shelter from the rain. Or maybe just the need to lose himself in something other than his own thoughts. Pushing open the creaking door, Ethan stepped into the darkness. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. Shadows stretched across the floor, cast by the faint glow of a broken window high above. The place was long abandoned, forgotten by time. And then he saw it. Against the far wall, half hidden beneath a tattered drop cloth, sat a grand piano. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The instrument was old, its once polished surface dulled by dust and neglect. But it was still beautiful. He moved toward it as if in a trance, reaching out to brush his fingers across the keys. A hollow, discordant note rang out, echoing through the cavernous space. Something stirred beneath the piano. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. He crouched down, peering into the shadows. There, nestled in the darkness, was a small wooden crate. The edges were warped from moisture, and the lid was slightly ajar. As he reached for it, a soft whimper emerged from inside. He hesitated, then lifted the lid. 7 tiny golden furred bodies huddled together, trembling against the cold. Puppies. Their fur was damp, their eyes wide with fear. They were impossibly small, fragile. Someone had abandoned them here, left them to die in the unforgiving night. A pang of anger twisted in Ethan's chest. How could anyone do such a thing? A sudden crack split the air. Before he could react, a wooden beam overhead groaned and splintered. In a heartbeat, he understood. Years of neglect had weakened the structure. The weight of the rain had done the rest. Instinct took over. Ethan grabbed the crate, hauling it out from beneath the piano just as the beam crashed down. The impact sent dust billowing into the air, shaking the floor beneath him. For a long moment, he stood there, chest heaving, clutching the crate to his chest. If he had hesitated even a second longer. He swallowed hard and looked down at the puppies. They whimpered, frightened but unharmed. Something inside him shifted. He had spent so long lost in his own emptiness, convinced that nothing mattered anymore. But now, in his arms, he held 7 tiny lives, fragile, helpless, and utterly dependent on him. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt something stir within him. A purpose. He couldn't leave them here. Pulling his coat tighter around himself, he turned and stepped back out into the rain. The night had grown colder, but the weight in his arms felt strangely warm. He had no idea what he would do next. But one thing was certain. These puppies were coming home with him. And perhaps, just perhaps, they had saved him as much as he had saved them. The puppies settled into Ethan's home as if they had always belonged there. In the beginning, they were timid, unsure of their new surroundings. But with each passing day, they grew more comfortable. Their tiny tails wagged more freely. Their eyes shone with trust. And they began to follow him everywhere. A golden wave of energy at his heels. Ethan hadn't planned on naming them. But as he watched them play, an idea took root. Music had been his life once. And though he had abandoned it, these little creatures had unknowingly brought it back into his world. So, he named them after the 7 notes of the musical scale: do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, and si. It felt fitting, as if they were part of a melody that had been waiting to be written. Mornings were now filled with the soft sounds of paws against the hardwood floor, the playful barks of the puppies, and the rhythmic tapping of rain against the window. At night, they curled up at his feet, their warmth a quiet comfort he hadn't known he needed. It was a different kind of music, one made of companionship and life. One evening, as the puppies dozed around him, Ethan found himself drawn to the piano again. The old instrument sat in the corner of his small living room, still coated in dust from its time in the abandoned warehouse. He had meant to clean it, to restore it, but he had hesitated, unsure if he was ready to touch music again. But tonight felt different. With a deep breath, he lifted the fallboard and pressed a key. The note rang out, imperfect but alive. He played another, then another, and before he realized it, his fingers had found an old melody. The sound filled the room, wrapping around him like an embrace from the past. And then, something strange happened. As he played, he felt a slight resistance beneath his left hand, as if the piano itself was responding. He stopped, fingers hovering over the keys. He pressed down again, and this time, he felt it, a hollow space beneath the wood, a hidden compartment. His pulse quickened. He ran his fingers along the underside of the piano, searching, until he found a small groove. With careful pressure, he pushed, and the panel gave way with a quiet click. Inside, resting against the aged wood, was a notebook. Ethan pulled it out, his hands careful, almost reverent. The leather cover was worn, the edges frayed with time. He opened it slowly, and his breath caught as he took in the pages. It was filled with music. Handwritten compositions filled each page, the notes inked with delicate precision. Some pieces were unfinished, others complete, and each one seemed to hum with emotion, as if the very soul of its creator had been captured within the melodies. On the first page, a single sentence was scrawled in elegant script. "If you have found this, let music guide you as it once guided me." Beneath it, a name, Gabriel Moore. Ethan frowned. The name tugged at something in his memory, but he couldn't quite place it. He ran his fingers over the ink, feeling the weight of the words. Who was Gabriel Moore, and why had he hidden this here? Curiosity gnawed at him. He set the notebook aside and reached for his laptop. The puppies stirred slightly at the movement but quickly settled again, their breathing slow and steady. He typed the name into the search bar and waited. It didn't take long for the results to appear. Gabriel Moore had been a pianist, a brilliant one, by all accounts. Articles from decades past spoke of his talent, his passion, and his tragic story. He had lost his family in a fire. Ethan swallowed hard as he read. The blaze had destroyed everything. His home, his loved ones, his past. Left with nothing, Gabriel had become a wanderer, carrying only his piano and the few things that mattered to him. He played wherever he could, pouring his grief into music. And then, one day, he vanished. No one knew what had happened to him. He simply disappeared, leaving behind only whispers and unanswered questions. Ethan stared at the screen. The weight of the discovery settled deep in his chest. The notebook, the music, the piano, this was all that remained of a man who had once bled his soul into every note. He looked over at the sleeping puppies, their small bodies curled into the warmth of the blankets. Gabriel Moore had lost everything. And yet, somewhere along the way, he had kept going. He had left his music behind, perhaps hoping that someday, someone would find it. Ethan traced the edge of the notebook, feeling a quiet understanding settle over him. For the first time in years, He felt something shift inside him. Maybe this wasn't just about Gabriel. Maybe, just maybe, this was about him too. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to let music lead him forward once more. The rain had stopped, but the cold still lingered in the air as Ethan made his way back to the abandoned warehouse. The streets were eerily quiet, the occasional flicker of a street lamp casting long shadows on the pavement. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, perhaps nothing at all. But something deep inside him urged him forward. There was more to this story. More to Gabriel Moore, and more to the mysterious connection between the man, the piano, and the 7 golden-furred puppies now sleeping safely in his home. When he reached the warehouse, the door creaked in protest as he pushed it open. The scent of damp wood and rust filled his nostrils. It was just as he had left it. The collapsed beam still lay in the center. Dust settled in the air like remnants of a forgotten past. The piano remained untouched, its presence like a silent guardian of the space. Ethan ran his fingers over the keys again, half expecting to feel something else hidden within. But the piano had already revealed its secret. Whatever he was looking for, it wasn't inside. He stepped back, scanning the room, his gaze drawn to the scattered debris near the back wall. If Gabriel had truly lived here, there had to be something left behind. He sifted through the remnants of a life once lived. Old wooden crates, rusted metal scraps, tattered fabric that might have once been a blanket. And then, beneath a pile of broken planks, he saw it, an envelope, yellowed with age, its edges curled from moisture. His breath caught as he picked it up. The ink on the front had faded, but he could still make out the names scrawled across it. To whoever finds this. Ethan carefully unfolded the letter. The paper was fragile, the handwriting slanted and uneven, as if written by a hand weakened by time. I don't know who will find this, but if you are reading these words, then perhaps fate has played its part. My name is Gabriel Moore, and this place was once my shelter. Not a home, but the closest thing I had to one. I have lived many years with nothing but music and the company of those who still had love to give. Even when the world had abandoned them. Ethan's grip on the letter tightened as he continued reading. One winter night, I found them, 7 tiny souls, shivering beneath an old oak tree at the edge of the city. They were so small, so helpless, and the snow had begun to fall thickly. I could not leave them. I could not walk away. So I carried them here, to this piano, the only thing in my life that had never left me. Ethan exhaled slowly, a lump forming in his throat. I tried my best. I fed them, kept them warm, and played music for them when the nights felt too long. They listened. They understood in ways no human ever had. But time is unkind, and my body is failing me. I can no longer care for them the way they deserve. I have left them here. Not because I want to, but because I must. I pray that someone who hears the music, will find them before it's too late. Because music has always guided me, and I trust that it will guide him to safety. The letter ended with a simple signature. Gabriel Moore. Ethan closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. The weight of the words settled over him like a heavy cloak. He had assumed the puppies had been abandoned cruelly. But that wasn't the truth at all. Gabriel hadn't left them out of neglect. He had left them out of love. Trusting that music would bring the right person to them. And somehow, it had. Ethan folded the letter carefully, slipping it into his coat pocket. He glanced around the warehouse once more, his gaze lingering on the piano. It had been more than an instrument. It had been Gabriel's companion. His only constant in a world that had taken so much from him. And now, in a strange and unexpected way, it had led Ethan to something he didn't know he needed. He had spent years believing that music had abandoned him. That inspiration had dried up like a well left untended. But maybe it hadn't. Maybe it had been waiting. Waiting for something. or someone, to remind him why it mattered. As he stepped outside, the cold air biting against his skin, he felt the weight on his heart lift just a little. He had come here searching for answers about Gabriel, but he had found something more. He had found a story waiting to be finished. And this time, he wouldn't walk away. Ethan sat at his piano, the worn leather notebook open beside him, its pages filled with Gabriel Moore's compositions. His fingers traced the inked notes, each one carrying the weight of a man who had poured his soul into music. He had spent weeks restoring these pieces, breathing life back into the melodies that had once filled an abandoned warehouse with sound. But he had done more than that. He had woven his own voice into them, blending his compositions with Gabriel's, creating something that felt like a conversation across time. This was no longer just about the past. This was about legacy, about continuation, about finding purpose in the echoes of what had been left behind. The idea had come to him late one night, as the puppies nestled against his feet, their warm bodies rising and falling with steady breaths. A concert, a way to honor Gabriel and the love he had given, not just to music, but to the 7 tiny souls he had left behind. Ethan would play Gabriel's music, along with his own, in a performance that would tell their story. The proceeds would go toward helping animals in need, ensuring that no other creatures would be left abandoned in the cold. And most importantly, the concert would be a chance to find homes for the puppies. It had been years since he had played for an audience. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. But this time, it wasn't about fame or acclaim. It was about something greater than himself. The night of the performance arrived, and the small theater hummed with anticipation. Word had spread about the story, about Gabriel Moore, the lost pianist, the hidden compositions, and the 7 golden retriever puppies who had been given a second chance. People had come not just for the music, but for the meaning behind it. Ethan stepped onto the stage, the spotlight casting a soft glow on the grand piano. The crowd hushed as he settled onto the bench, his hands poised above the keys. For a moment, he closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, feeling the weight of everything that had led him here. Then, he began to play. The first notes rang out, rich and full, the opening measures of one of Gabriel's pieces. It was haunting, delicate yet powerful, filled with longing. As the music unfolded, Ethan felt himself sinking into it, letting the melody guide him. He could almost see Gabriel, his presence lingering in the quiet spaces between the notes. Then, seamlessly, he transitioned into his own composition, an answer to Gabriel's song. It was hopeful, rising like dawn breaking over a dark horizon. The 2 melodies wove together, past and present intertwining in a way that felt inevitable, as if they had always belonged to the same story. Tears shimmered in the eyes of some audience members, and Ethan understood why. This wasn't just music. This was a journey, a story of loss and love, of abandonment and rescue, of finding home in the most unexpected places. And at the heart of it all were the 7 puppies. Between pieces, the audience was introduced to them, families who had come not just for the concert, but to meet the dogs. Stepped forward, one by one, 6 of the puppies found new homes. Smiling children held them close. Couples cradled them in their arms, promising him the love and security that Gabriel had once wished for them. But one puppy remained. Dew, the smallest of the litter, stood at Ethan's feet, his golden fur illuminated by the stage lights. His tiny frame was still more delicate than his siblings, his body slightly thinner, his movements more cautious, but his eyes were steady, locked onto Ethan with unwavering trust. People approached, asking about him, but every time, Dew pressed himself against Ethan's leg, his tail wagging weakly but with determination. And in that moment, Ethan understood. He had never intended to keep any of them. The plan had always been to find them homes, to give them the futures they deserved. But Du had already found his home. Ethan knelt down, running his fingers gently through the soft fur behind Du's ears. "You're not going anywhere, are you?" he murmured. Du licked his fingers, his tail thumping against the stage floor. The realization settled over Ethan like the final note of a long-forgotten melody, the kind that resolves in perfect harmony. He had saved Du, just as he had saved the others. But the truth was, Du had saved him too. As the final song of the night filled the theater, Ethan played not just for Gabriel, or for the puppies, or for the audience. He played for himself, and for the first time in years, the music felt whole again. The years that followed the concert became a journey Ethan never could have foreseen. What had begun as a tribute, a single night meant to honor Gabriel Moore's legacy, transformed into something far greater. The music Ethan had resurrected from the old notebook was no longer just Gabriel's, it had become a part of him. Woven into the very fabric of his artistry, each note he played carried the weight of two lives. Two stories that had intertwined across time, bridging the past with the present. Word of Gabriel's music spread. The haunting, deeply emotional compositions captured the hearts of audiences everywhere, not just because of their beauty but because of the story behind them. Music historians, journalists, and admirers alike became fascinated by the lost pianist who had once played to an audience of stray dogs and empty spaces. It wasn't long before a renowned organization dedicated to preserving forgotten compositions reached out to Ethan. They wanted to create a permanent exhibition, a space where Gabriel Moore's music could live on, where his piano and notebook could be kept safe, and where his story could be told to future generations. It was an honor Ethan hadn't expected, but he knew it was the right thing to do. Gabriel had given so much of himself to his music, and now, after decades of silence, the world was finally listening. On the day of the exhibition's unveiling, the city's grand music conservatory was alive with quiet anticipation. Ethan stood before the entrance, taking in the sight of people gathering, musicians, scholars, lovers of music who had been touched by Gabriel's work. And beside him, as always, was Du. The little golden retriever had grown. No longer the frail, uncertain pup he had once been. But in many ways, he was still the same, loyal, steady, and always by Ethan's side. Over the years, Du had become more than just a companion. He had become a symbol of the story that had changed Ethan's life. Wherever Ethan performed, Du was there, curled up by the piano, his presence a quiet reminder of the night they had found each other. Inside the exhibition hall, the air was thick with reverence. At the center of the room, illuminated under soft lighting, stood Gabriel's piano. It had been carefully restored, its wood polished, its keys cleaned, yet it still bore the marks of time. The cracks in the varnish, the slightly uneven keys. These imperfections told a story, one that no amount of restoration could erase. Beside the piano, encased in glass, was the leather-bound notebook. The pages were open to the first composition Ethan had played that night. The one that had started it all. Beneath it, a small plaque bore the words Gabriel had written all those years ago. "If you have found this, let music guide you as it once guided me." Ethan stepped forward, his fingers brushing lightly against the piano's surface. Memories flooded his mind, the first time he had played this instrument in that abandoned warehouse. The moment he had discovered the hidden compartment. The night he had held 7 tiny lives in his arms, unaware that they were about to change everything. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Gabriel, your story will never be forgotten." As if sensing the weight of the moment, Du pressed his head against Ethan's leg, his tail wagging gently. Ethan smiled, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. That evening, Ethan took the stage once more, this time in the conservatory's grand concert hall. The seats were filled with those who had come to honor Gabriel's music. But as Ethan settled at the piano, he knew that this performance was as much for himself as it was for anyone else. He placed his fingers on the keys and began to play. The melody started softly, a whisper of sound that grew with each passing measure. It was one of Gabriel's compositions. But as always, Ethan allowed himself to blend his own voice into it, creating something new while honoring what had come before. The music swelled, filling the room with all the emotions that had carried him through this journey: loss, discovery, hope, and, above all, connection. As the final notes faded into silence, Ethan glanced down to find Dew curled up beside the piano, his head resting on his paws, completely at peace. The sight brought a lump to Ethan's throat. For the first time in a long time, he felt whole. The applause rose around him. But Ethan didn't move. He let the moment settle, let himself breathe in everything that had led him here. Music had once been his prison, something he had run from. But now, it was his bridge, connecting him to Gabriel, to Dew, to the past and the future. And for the first time, he knew without a doubt, this was where he was meant to be.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.